Back. Joining us now from Tehran is Saeed Mohammad Marandi. He is an Iranian academic and political analyst. He is Dean of the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. Dr. Marandi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
As you would understand, it's very difficult to get clear, precise information from the battlefield in this fight against ISIL. But as far as Iran is concerned, we're hearing all kinds of reports from Iran just has a few dozen military advisors in this battle to, as we just heard from our previous guest, there are Iranian regular military being involved in this fight. What exactly is Iran's involvement?
I don't think there are any regular troops. I think probably the number of advisors is higher than being in the tens. I think it's probably in the hundreds, but I'm just guessing. But I doubt severely that there are regular troops. Just like in Syria, despite the fact that there were claims for years that there were Iranian regulars fighting in Syria, there were, I don't think, ever more than 100 Iranians in the country at one time.
Now we have a very unique situation where we have Iran and the United States essentially on the same side fighting ISIL here. I want you to take a listen to a recent exchange at the US Congress at a Senate hearing. Secretary of State John Kerry was being questioned at that hearing. He's being questioned in this exchange by the Florida Senator Marco Rubio. Let's watch.
If the U.S. sent more military personnel into Iraq as trainers, advisors, logistical support, they would support that? Iran would support that?
Well, they're not going to come out and openly support it, and they obviously would be nervous about it, but they're not going to object if that's what it is.
What do you make of that?
Well, I don't think the Iranians would welcome U.S. troops in Iraq because the Americans have never played a positive role in Iraq, and it doesn't play a positive role even now. The airstrikes that the so-called coalition, the numbers that they've been carrying out over the past few months, ever since ISIL came into Iraq, has been insignificant, a few a day, whereas the Syrian Air Force alone at times carries out over 100 airstrikes. So either the American Air Force is a lot smaller than that of Syria, or the Americans really aren't being all that serious. And on the other hand, the Americans are allowing, or they're closing their eyes to Turkish support for ISIL, for the Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda, as well as Jordanian support, and the Saudis and the Qataris through Jordan, and the Israelis along their border, their support for Nusra, which is, again, as I said, Al-Qaeda. So the Americans are playing a very strange game in a way. They want to contain ISIL, it seems, but at the same time, they're not really doing anything to stop other countries from supporting it. But Iran would not block any agreement between the Iraqi government and the United States because Iran sees Iraq as a sovereign country, and they're allowed, obviously, to do what they want. But the Iranians won't cooperate with the United States, basically because the Iranians don't trust American intentions in Iraq or Syria.
Well, a complex situation, as you point out. Now, one of the proposals being discussed in the halls of power here in Washington, as we heard from our previous guest, is for the formation of an organization. This would be a Sunni organization that would have a political component in it and a military component in it to resolve issues that would take place after this battle. Let's say ISIL is defeated. And in order to seek out some kind of resolution between the two warring sides, that they would have this organization which would be modeled very closely on NATO. Like NATO has a political component and a military component, this is an organization made up of mainly Sunni nations. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia would be involved in this. I mean, how would Iran respond to something like that?
I think Iraq and Syria would reject that out of hand. Iraq is a sovereign country, and the United States has no right to force such an idea upon the Iraqi people, and the same with Syria. The Saudis and some of these other countries that you've mentioned, they have actually been the driving force behind these extremists for many years now. They helped create Wahhabism and groups of different Wahhabi organizations across the globe. That's why this extremism is not simply in Syria or Iraq. In Nigeria, you see Boko Haram. In Somalia, it's Al-Shabaab. In Libya, which the NATO really destroyed the country. and it created a huge problem there, just as in Syria. We have Ansar al-Sharia, which is another al-Qaeda group. And then in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and Pakistan, these are all due to the influence of these very countries that the United States is talking about. So I don't think the Iraqi government would accept that, nor the Syrian government. And the Iranians recognize that the root of the problem actually lies with some of these countries.
You know, and I'll ask you this question, and I asked our two previous guests about it as well. When we look at this battle against ISIL, which is taking place right now, what is the danger of this descending into a sort of tit-for-tat sectarian battle, payback time, with the Shias taking on the Sunnis?
Well, I think that's something that the Saudis and others have been promoting for many years now. The Saudis and other oil-rich Arab countries which have been promoting not Sunni Islam, but their Wahhabi ideology, they have tried to use sectarianism as well as racism and other forms of animosity to create divisions in this region to promote their own interests. And the United States has actually played a very big part in this as well. In Iraq, after the United States overthrew the Iraqi government, and we must remember the only country in this region that opposed the American invasion was Iran. The Americans promoted basically sectarianism by playing off different groups against one another in Iraq. Otherwise, in Iraq, for centuries, these people, Christians, Muslims, Shias, Sunnis, Kurds, had been living alongside one another relatively peacefully. So the Americans created this problem. In Syria, again, the Americans allowed the Saudis and the Qataris to support extremist organizations. For example, Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who was an al-Qaeda figure, they supported him, they cooperated with him, NATO, in Libya. Then he went to Istanbul, a NATO country, and gave support, this al-Qaeda figure, both funding as well as volunteers to the Syrian opposition. This was taking place under the nose of NATO. So this sectarianism and this extremism is something that Western countries were basically aware of, and they allowed their allies to promote, just like they closed their eyes to the Taliban when the Saudis were supporting the Taliban in the 90s, and when they themselves were supporting al-Qaeda in the 1980s. So sectarianism is often a useful tool to Western countries to basically create divisions among people.
Dr. Marandi, thanks for joining us. That was Syed Mohammed Marandi talking to us from Tehran. And